I love the power of music, the impact of lyrics, and just today, I don't want us to rush through this as a process. I want us to. I know we're going to come back at the end of when I talk, and Amy's going to lead another song, and I just want you to today. Don't rush through this. Don't just tick this off as one of the things you're going to do today. Allow this time together to bring change within you, within me, within all of us. Jesus said some really strange things. And one of the things that he said was, if you have ears to hear, well, most people have ears. But I think what Jesus was saying, and he said it more than once, is that what he was sharing was for everyone, but not everyone would hear. And I just encourage you today. I know that part of what I'm going to share today has taken a lifetime within me to get to this place, and there's some depth, there's some things in here today that I believe will help you, and for some of you, as you're hearing the truth of God's word today, it's going to be, aha, I get that, I see that, I understand that, and and so don't rush through this. Just be open to hear something fresh, to see something different that you may not have seen before. I just want to pray. Lord, I just pray for your help, that today I could get out what you've been putting into me, and that could be helpful for others. And I thank you for that. I thank you for your spirit that guides and directs and communicates through us. Well, probably only in the last week, there was a lot of media coverage of a cluster of COVID air in the Hallam area, where one family had gone outside of where they were meant to be and infected other sort of members of their families. And the big thing about it was that the government, the Victorian government, chose not to prosecute them, to fine them for what they had done on the basis that they would tell them the truth, tell them where they'd been, who they'd been in contact with. And a lot of people got upset with that because in the end, the people did the right thing and they told what had happened, but they didn't do it because they were trying to save lives or slow the disease down or help people get out of the restrictions earlier. They did it so they wouldn't be punished, they wouldn't be fined. And see, that's the best that the fear of punishment can do. It may be able to get the right behaviour, but the motivation underneath is not the right motivation. Our society has this love affair with punishment. The whole entertainment industry is built on punishment. How many movies have you seen and watched, and you wait to the end to make sure the baddie suffers, the baddie's caught, that they fall off the edge of the bridge or down this big cliff, and you want them to suffer and die because inside of us we want bad behaviour, bad people to be punished. Our whole legal system is based on punishment, and the law and order in our community is based around punishment. Right now in Australia, 55% of all those that have gone to prison within 2 years of coming out will have reoffended and be back in prison. The fear of punishment doesn't work. It doesn't change people on the inside. And that way of life, this punishment way of life, it begins when we're really young. Bad behaviour, bad consequences, the wooden spoon, time out, um, privileges taken away, even like an angry face from a parent, disapproval looks. It can be punishment. I remember when our youngest daughter Bronnie was little. I can't remember what happened, but I remember going into a room just sort of around bedtime and telling her off for something. And as was explaining and correcting and as a parent doing what I thought I should be doing, she looked at me and the little bottom lip started to twitch and move a little bit, and she goes, "Daddy, Daddy, you're scaring me." And it was a moment that did something inside me. I thought, that's not what I set out to do. I'm not trying to scare my little daughter. I'm trying to help her. But we only know sometimes punishment as that way to get through that place. And growing up, you've either sort of had two ways of how you respond to punishment. If you were the strong-willed child, you probably rebelled. You didn't sort of do what was expected. You pushed against punishment, and you still behaved badly. I can remember being forced to mow the lawns as a teenager at Donald, and inside, on the outside I was mowing the lawns, but on the inside I was rebelling, and then I saw a moment, and it was the right next to the lawn were Mum's daffodils growing. They didn't have flowers on them yet, just the green bits shooting up, and so I very deliberately mowed down all Mum's daffodils. I didn't tell Mum or Dad, but they soon found out, and when they came to me upset that I'd mown all Mum's daffodils down to the ground level, I pretended I didn't know the difference between daffodils and grass, and I didn't get asked to mow the lawns for a while after that. But see, if you are compliant, if you're obedient, you sort of learned your lessons and you changed your behaviour. Now, my wife Coral, she was that type of child, and she learned. But unfortunately for Mum and Dad, for me, I wasn't. But what's surprising is that both responses are driven from the same motivation. It's the fear of punishment. Some young people, at home, they're this compliant child. They seem to just fit in and do everything that's expected. And then they leave home. They go to uni, they get a job, they change their group of friends. And suddenly this quiet, responsible child is a wild child. They're suddenly doing things you would never expect them to do. They're doing things differently than the way their family have done life. And it can be very stressful for some parents as those teenage kids push against the controls, the fear of punishment that existed within their home. Fear of punishment, it creates a sense of shame. And shame can be, it's very destructive, because what happens is that we start believing there's something wrong with us. And because we think there's something wrong with us, we start to feel unworthy to be loved, to be valued, to be accepted by others. And our experience of punishment reinforces our relational pain of rejection, of disapproval, of criticism based on what we do. And some of you will actually end up telling yourselves, I must not expose my flaws, my weaknesses, my failures. I will hide behind being good by performing, by doing what people expect of me. For others, you just know that you can't hide your stuff. You're just going to let it all out there. You push back against the rules. You even make up your own rules. You refuse to fit in, to be conformed. And I guess some of those that have been involved in the protests in Melbourne against masks, they are that person. That child will often grow up and have a real pushback against governments, be very critical of governments, and if anyone will listen to them, they'll tell them what the government's doing wrong. But both approaches come from the same desire for self-preservation, to save ourselves from punishment. The really, really big problem with this is that we think God works the same way. We think that heaven and hell is based on this. It's based on do good, get good. Do bad, get bad. But hell has nothing to do with punishment. It has everything to do with separation. Separation based on an identity that we choose. And heaven's not a reward for being good. In fact, being a Christian is getting what we don't deserve. And we're raised in a society where the fear of punishment is our way of life. And it creates a cycle. And the way this cycle works is that we hate being punished, but then we do that to someone else. If our wife, husband, partner offends us, hurts us, we withdraw love, we become quiet, or we react and unload and say all these things, that words that are actually meant to hurt. But then when it's all over, we say, well, I didn't mean that. I was just upset. I was angry. Road rage is just one driver trying to punish another driver for offending them, for doing something they thought was wrong. If you've had a friend betray you, a boss, someone you know that you loan money to and they never paid it back, and you're hurt by someone, you will punish them by withdrawing, by confronting them, or we tell other people about them so that they will punish them as well. And our wrong ideas of heaven and hell come from this punishment lens that we see life through. But nothing God does has anything to do with punishment. And God himself has three main ways to try to convince us about that truth. One is that he uses his word, the Bible, which is a progressive revelation of God's heart for us. Another way is what Jesus did, how he lived, what he achieved when he went to the cross, why he did all these things. And the third way, God uses Christians. And he uses Christians in a unique way. He uses us to show how he works by how we work with each other, how we care for each other, how we love each other, how we love our communities, how we work in our communities. The third way, I'm not sure was actually a good idea, because I think sometimes as Christians we get it horribly wrong, and it's very damaging. But see, God chose this third way because it's his way of explaining his big, grand plan for humanity. See, in the beginning, God never created people to populate heaven. He created people to populate earth. And when Jesus returns, we're not going up to this imaginary heaven up in the sky somewhere. Jesus is coming back to set up the culture, to set up heaven on earth. That he would have this amazing new earth that he would come and set up his kingdom on. In fact, in Revelation 21, John records these words and he says this: "Now the dwelling of God is with people, and he will live with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, no mourning or crying of pain, for the old things have passed away." And that includes our addiction to punishment. See, forgiveness, not punishment, is the way of life in heaven. It's why when Jesus taught us to pray, he began with asking God, praying for us as we pray, would say, "God, forgive us as we forgive them." In fact, Jesus taught on that, and he said, if we don't forgive, he can't forgive. Because, see, forgiveness changes the cycle. It reverses a cycle of punishment or being punished and then punishing others. And unless that cycle stops, nothing happens different. And forgiveness stops that cycle. It changes it. When Paul was teaching us about backpacks and boulders, about the thing that we carry that's light for us, but the heavy burden that we're to carry on behalf of other people, he begins that whole teaching with this one sentence. It's brilliant. I want you to hear it. And this is what he begins with: "If someone is caught in sin, restore them gently." There's nothing about punishment, it's restoration that Paul's saying. If someone messes up, don't punish them, restore them. But then he gives this advice. He says, "But watch yourself, or you may also be tempted." There's a humility in here. Paul's trying to show us that the only way you restore people is through humility. But see, I left out something that Paul said in that sentence. And I left out who he was talking to. And this is what I left out. Paul says he's talking to those who are spiritual, to those who are mature, to mature Christians. He's saying, but watch yourself. Be careful, because you could also mess up. You'll never restore someone, and don't miss this. You'll never forgive someone if you feel superior to them. If you think, I would never do that, I could never do that. See, there are some things I know I will never do. But within me, it's important that I know that within me is a seed to do anything destructive. And so the only way you can restore people, the only way you can forgive someone is to come humbly and not feel superior. And as Christians and as churches, we talk a lot about God's love and His grace. But it's possible to operate out of a punishment belief system and not even be fully aware of it. And the problem with that, the consequences, they're devastating. There was a husband and wife. They were newly married. They had a couple of kids. And the husband had an affair. It was a short affair, but it was an affair, sexual affair with someone. And he went to his wife and confessed. And they began this discussion, and they got to a point where his wife said to him that she wanted to forgive him, that they wanted to rebuild their marriage, restore their marriage. And the guy was part of a worship band in a church, and he went to the leadership of the church and he told them what he'd done and that they wanted to rebuild their marriage, and his wife had forgiven him. But the problem is that the leadership team, their response was punishment. It wasn't restoration. Now, they loved God. They loved people, but their response was just this place of punishment. And the first thing they said was, well, you won't be able to play in the band for at least 12 months. And they began a process of punishment, not restoration, and that destroyed this couple. It in the end, this couple both walked away from God. And I can remember the husband said to me once, he said, I know God can forgive me, but I can't forgive myself. Because he hadn't received mercy and grace, he'd received law, and so it wasn't modelled to him from these leaders, and he couldn't model it himself in his own life. When we first started our church in Sydney, in the early days, which is maybe 12 years ago now, we had a young guy playing drums, about 19 years of age, and he and his girlfriend were walking up this set of stairs for youth one night, and they caught me at the top of the stairs, and almost by sort of unawares, by surprise, he said to me, Lex, I just want to let you know that my girlfriend's pregnant. We're going to be having a baby. And my heart, I know my heart was to help them and restore them and help them through the process. And I began with that at the beginning of the conversation, but then something came out of my mouth, and it was punishment. And I said to him, well, you're going to have to stand down from the worship team for just a short time, whatever it is. And I know that behind that was the voices on some of my board, the expectations that is what I would do. And it wasn't until later I realised how damaging my initial response was. And I remember going and meeting with them in a cafe, and through tears, I apologised for getting it wrong. They still left the church hurt. Their family left, and it's one of the things that I carry within me, that I know I got it wrong in my leadership, and it's grieved me from the outcome. But I'm not that person. It changed me. I got to see that God has a better way, a much, much better way. And within every Bible narrative, there's a question we should all ask, and that is, who am I in the story? And John ends his account of the life of Jesus with a story. And the opening scene is the lake in Galilee. It's early morning, and 7 out of the remaining 11 disciples have been out all night. They've been fishing. The traumatic experience of Jesus being crucified on the cross, him rising from the dead, it's all happened. Like, he's appeared to them twice. That part of the story's behind them, but they're still confused. They don't know where the future's going. They don't know what's going to happen. That sense that Jesus sold them a dream that they would become fishers of men, that seems like it's all over. What do you do when God disappoints you? What do you do if you're Peter and you've disappointed yourself? See, Peter had given up on God. He'd literally walked away from Jesus, from the team, the night that Jesus was arrested. At the very moment when he was needed the most, he walked away, and people on Facebook questioned him and said, "But aren't you one of them?" And he'd go, "No, I don't know him." And he used all these F words to convince them that he had nothing to do with Jesus. He didn't know him. He wasn't one of his followers. And when Luke tells us the story, he tells us that at the end of that, Peter went out into the darkness and he cried bitterly. That's the voice of shame. And every one of the 4 gospel narratives tells us this story. But see, Mark tells us something that John and Luke leave out. Because when Mark is writing his gospel narrative, Peter's looking over his shoulder. Peter's giving him the detail. Peter's telling him all the things that happened. And so Mark includes something that Peter wanted written down. And this is it. Mark says that in this moment when Peter rejected Jesus publicly, he says, Peter called down curses upon himself. Shame will cause you to hate yourself. It'll cause you to speak curses over your life. You'll feel unworthy to be loved and to be accepted by others. And that's all Peter had known. He'd only ever known growing up a culture of punishment and shame. So what do you do when Christians let you down? When churches let you down? When you feel God's disappointed you? When you're disappointed yourself? You go back to what you used to do. And Peter says to his mates, "I'm going fishing." And they go, Can we come too? The sun's just coming up. And there's this lone figure on the shore. It's Jesus, but they don't know it's Jesus. And he calls out to them, "Party on! Party on!" It's a Greek word and it's a term of endearment. It's a, "Hey boys! Hey boys!" For Josh in the UK and Darcy, "Hey lads!" Right? It's this beautiful term of endearment that he calls out to them. And he's calling out to his little bunch of deserters. They've all gone back to what they used to do. As a kid, when I was in trouble, Dad's voice would go from "Lex" to "Lurks." It just suddenly got deeper and harsher, right? And "hey boys" is not the language of a God of punishment. It's not the language of disapproval. It's "hey boys." It's a form of affection. "Have you caught any fish?" That's the moment that I think Jesus had a little chuckle to himself, a little laugh, because while they've been fishing, Jesus has been talking to fish. He's been saying to the fish, "You get caught in their nets and it's straight to fish hell for you." And then he says to them, put your net out on the other side of the boat. You get some fish. And they do. And suddenly you've got all these fish going, catch me, catch me. And they're jumping in the nets, right? And that is the moment that John goes, it's Jesus. On the shore, it's Jesus. And Peter jumps into the water and starts swimming. But this is the moment for Peter when he realizes that God is not a God of punishment. Because instead of swimming out to sea, he swims in to see Jesus. In Romans chapter 2, Paul tells us it's the kindness of God, it's the goodness of God that leads us to see things differently, to change internally. It's not the fear of punishment. And when Peter gets to the shore, he finds a fire going. Jesus is already cooking some fish. There's fresh bread. Can you feel the love behind that breakfast for his little bunch of deserters? And when they finish eating, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, do you really, really, really love me more than these, more than your mates, more than these times of fishing? Do you really love me more than everyone else here? And Peter goes, yeah, I do. And Jesus asks him again, and then asks him again. By the third time, Peter's hurting. He can't get out enough inside of him that he does love Jesus. Can I tell you what didn't happen on the shore that morning when Jesus kept asking Peter, do you really love him? Can I tell you what didn't happen? Peter didn't say sorry. He didn't apologise to the other guys. He didn't apologise to Jesus because there was no pressure to apologise and say sorry. There's no expectation on him. You know when a brother or sister or two brothers have a fight and mum grabs them and say, now say sorry. And they say, sorry. And mum goes, no, say it like you mean it. Sorry. Like, that's external. Jesus wasn't doing that to Peter. He was going somewhere much, much deeper. And I'll tell you what else didn't happen that morning. There's no punishment. There's no disapproval of Jesus. There's no, you can't preach for 6 months. There's no restriction on his gifting, on his leadership. No restrictions. Do you know, it's only days later that Peter preached a message to a whole lot of people in Jerusalem, and 3,000 people at one time responded to this good news that he was sharing about the life of Jesus and what this means to us. But don't miss this. Jesus didn't say it's okay. We all mess up. Don't worry about it, Peter. She'll be right. Jesus didn't trivialise what Peter had done. So what did Jesus do? He reconnected Peter. And he didn't do it through his head. He did it through his heart. And he recommissioned his leadership gifting, not to where it used to be, but to a higher place, to more responsibility, to more influence. He elevated his leadership. And all Peter had done was prove you can't trust Peter. All Peter had done was, everyone knew if Peter said something, it never happened. Peter would always let you down. That's all he had proven to do. Now, most employees, in fact, most church leaders would think that was not wise, that was even foolish what Jesus did. And sadly, many Christian leaders around the world will not do that. They will not do what Jesus did. But it worked. And Peter went on to become one of the key leaders in the early church, one of the leading leaders of Christianity and the way it spread through the world. Peter. Was Jesus just lucky? Or could this kingdom culture, a way of life where the fear of punishment does not exist. Could that work in our real lives, in our families, in our friendships, in the way we do church? It worked for Jesus because he began by helping Peter to change on the inside. When Jesus first came back from the dead, of all the disciples he would appear to, it wasn't goody-goody John, the obedient, compliant John who was there still at the cross when all the other disciples had gone, the one Jesus commissioned to look after his mum. It wasn't John. It was Peter. Peter alone. Peter crushed by self-hatred, regret, defeated. This is the Peter that Jesus found. We don't know what happened in that little get-together. It's private. It's one-on-one. Just Jesus and Peter. No one's telling what happened. But we all need those moments, those encounters with an unpunishable God when it's just you and him, where the goodness of God, the kindness of God leads us to change from the inside before it ever gets onto the outside. Please don't misunderstand what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about no consequences for our actions when there's no internal change. I'm not talking about no discipline when discipline is solely to restore someone, when discipline is actually a means to bring healing and wholeness to someone. I'm talking about the culture of heaven, where the threat of punishment and fear and shame and condemnation does not exist, and it's not used as a weapon to conform us into some form of external behaviour. When Coral gets back from town, if I see her drive in, if I hear the car come in, I rush out to help carry in the shopping. And I don't do that because I've had this lifetime ambition to carry groceries. And I don't do it because she nags me. I don't do it because she will criticise me or complain if I don't. I do it because I love her. It's that simple. And Peter's life was transformed when he realised that within him was actually a love for God, because he had discovered an unpunishable God who found him at his lowest, who restored him when he didn't deserve it. A God that comes to Peter individually. It's the same God that's wanting to come to you, to me, to I, to begin something on the inside long before it gets to be on the outside. Over to you, Amy.